individual spirit beings and the constant foundation of the universe. Part 1. You will remember our considerations regarding various claims and assertions made nowadays by psychoanalysts. My intention was to show that the concept of the unconscious, as defined by psychoanalysis, lacks foundation. So long as psychoanalysts cannot get beyond this totally negative concept of the unconscious, we shall have to stand by our statement that psychoanalysis is using inadequate tools for its work on a phenomenon which it is important to work on today. Nevertheless, since the psychoanalysts do indeed endeavor to research the spirit-soul element, and also follow up this spirit-soul element in the social realm, one cannot but grant that their efforts represent a more significant effort than that achieved in this realm by official academic science. However, since efforts are also underway to bring analytical psychology into everyday life through education, through therapy, and soon probably also through social politics, the dangers involved must give rise to some concern. So let us ask, what is it that today's researchers are unable, but also unwilling to get to grips with? They recognize that there is a soul element which lies outside consciousness. Indeed, they seek to find the soul element that is outside consciousness. But they cannot make the effort to recognize the spirit itself. Spirit can never in any way be encompassed by the concept of the unconscious, for an unconscious spirit would be like a human being without a head. I have pointed out to you that in certain states of hysteria, there are people who can go about in the street and see only the body, but not the head of other people. Not seeing anyone's head is a specific kind of illness. Similarly, amongst today's researchers, there are some who think they are seeing the whole spirit. But by presenting it as something unconscious, they show that they themselves are victims of the illusion that there would be an unconscious spirit, a spirit without consciousness, if we were to step across the threshold of consciousness, either in the right sense, as we always do on the basis of spiritual scientific research, or in a pathological, abnormal way, which is always the case with patients who are treated by psychoanalysts. When we step across the threshold of consciousness, we always enter a realm of spirit. Whether it is subconscious or superconscious, it is always a realm of spirit. A realm in which the spirit is conscious in one way or another, in one form or another. Where there is spirit, there is consciousness. All we have to do is find out what conditions the All we have to do is find out what conditions the consciousness is subject to. Spiritual science, in particular, gives us the possibility of recognizing which kind of consciousness a particular form of spirituality has. Last week we talked of a woman leaving a social gathering and then running away from horses and having to be prevented from jumping into a river before being brought back to the house she had just left, in order there to be brought together with the host, because she was in love with him in some unclear, subconscious way. It cannot be said in such a case that the spirit of which the woman is not conscious, but which is urging and leading her on, is an unconscious spirit, nor that it is an unconscious soul element. No, it is something very conscious. The demonic spirit who leads the woman back to the man whom she loves in an improper way is actually much cleverer in its consciousness than is the woman herself in her upper story, by which I mean her consciousness. When we step across the threshold of consciousness in some way, the spirits who move about there are not unconscious spirits. They are spirits who are conscious in the way they move about and get active. The term unconscious spirit, as used by psychoanalysts, is meaningless. I might just as easily, seeing things from my point of view, regard this whole illustrious gathering sitting here as my unconscious, if I knew nothing about it. It would be equally wrong to call the spiritual beings who are around us, and who in cases like the one mentioned seize hold of the person, unconscious spirits. They are subconscious, they are not grasped by the consciousness that happens to be in us at that moment, but for themselves they are entirely conscious. Especially for the task of spiritual science in our time, it is extremely important to know this, because knowledge about the spirit realm that lies beyond the threshold, knowledge about real individualities who are aware of themselves, is not something known only to present-day spiritual science. For it is, in fact, knowledge that is very ancient indeed. In earlier times it was known through the old atavistic art of clairvoyance. But today it is known by other means. One is gradually learning about it. Knowledge about real spirits who are outside the scope of human consciousness, and whose conditions of life are not like those of human beings, although they are in constant contact with them and can seize hold of them in their thinking, feeling, and will. This knowledge has always existed. It is knowledge that was always regarded as the secret possession of certain brotherhoods, who treated it within their circle as a strictly esoteric matter. Why did they treat it as being strictly esoteric? To enter into an explanation of this now would be going too far, but this much can be said. The individual brotherhoods were always honestly of the opinion that the majority of human beings were insufficiently mature to possess this wisdom. And this was to a large extent indeed the case. But many other brotherhoods, those we call the brotherhoods of the left-hand path, endeavored to keep this knowledge to themselves, also because when such knowledge is possessed by a small group, it gives that group power over others who do not possess it. And there have always been endeavors aimed at ensuring that certain groups had power over others. This could be done by regarding certain knowledge as an esoteric matter, but then using it to gain power over something else. Today it is especially necessary to be really clear about these things. As you know, and as I have been telling you in recent lectures, humanity has been living in a very special spiritual situation since 1879. Very specially effective spirits of darkness have been removed from the spiritual world into the physical since 1879. And those who hold the secrets connected with this fact in an unlawful manner within small groups are able to do all kinds of mischief with these things. Today I shall begin by showing you how certain secrets connected with the evolution of the present time can be misused. You must then make an effort to bring together what I shall tell you today, which is more the historical aspect, with what I shall say about it tomorrow. You all know that for quite a while now, within our anthroposophical stream of spiritual science, attention has been drawn to the fact that the 20th century is one in which a special relationship of human evolution with Christ is to come about. In the 20th century, in fact during the first half, as you know, an event will take place which is also hinted at in the first of my mystery plays, namely that Christ will become, for a sufficiently large number of people, a being who is actually present in the etheric realm. We know that we are now living in the age of materialism. We know that materialism has been reaching its zenith since about the middle of the 19th century. However, the reality is that opposite poles always coincide. The zenith of materialism in human evolution has to coincide with its opposite, namely an inwardness in human evolution that leads to Christ being indeed seen in the etheric realm. It is understandable that this very announcement about the new relationship which Christ is about to enter into with humanity will be met with upset and aversion amongst those who, as members of certain brotherhoods, want to make use of the knowledge of this 20th century event, this event of the appearance of the etheric Christ, for their own ends, and therefore do not want it to become common knowledge. There are some brotherhoods, and brotherhoods also influence public opinion in ways that people are least likely to notice. There are certain secret brotherhoods who put it about that materialism will soon fizzle out, indeed that it has already fizzled out in some ways. This unfortunate, pitiable, clever in quotation marks, individuals who spread the doctrine in all kinds of meetings, books, and associations, that materialism has run its course, and that comprehension of the Spirit is already beginning to dawn, although they are unable to do more than pronounce the word Spirit and dole out a few isolated empty phrases. These are the individuals who are more or less serving those who have an interest in putting about something that is untrue, namely that materialism has fizzled out. This is an untruth. For materialism is, on the contrary, still on the increase, and it will flourish best when people delude themselves into believing that they are no longer materialists. Materialism is on the increase, and it will continue being on the increase for another 400 to 500 years. As I have so often stressed here, what is needed now is a clear and conscious awareness of the fact that this is the case. Humanity will remain unscathed if human beings work in their spiritual and cultural life in the knowledge that the fifth post-Atlantean epoch has the task of drawing forth from general human evolution what is materialistic in its essence. But at the same time, this must be countered with an equal degree of what is spiritual in its essence. In previous lectures, I have spoken about what human beings must learn in the fifth post-Atlantean age, namely, to wage a fully conscious battle against the evil that is making its appearance in human evolution. Just as the battle regarding an understanding of birth and death took place during the fourth post-Atlantean age, so is it now time for the battle regarding the understanding of evil. The important thing now is to grasp spiritual teachings in full consciousness, not to throw dust in the eyes of one's contemporaries as though the devil of materialism did not exist. This devil will be very much on the increase. Those who are dealing with these things in a wrong way know about the event of Christ's appearance just as well as I do, but they are treating this event in a different way. To understand why this is, one must pay attention to the following. With humanity as it is in this fifth post-Atlantean age, many people in their indolence utter the entirely unjustified sentence, quote, "What we have to do while we are living here between birth and death is immerse ourselves fully in life. Whether we then enter a spiritual world after passing through death remains to be seen, and meanwhile we can wait. Let us enjoy life as though nothing but a physical world existed. When we step into the spiritual world through death, well, we shall see then whether such a world exists." Close quote. This statement is just about as intelligent as the oath, quote, "As truly as there is a God in heaven, I am an atheist." Close quote. The degree of intelligence in that remark is about the same as in this oath, yet it is how many people think, who say, quote, "We shall see after we die what it is like over there. Meanwhile, there is no need to bother with any kind of spiritual science." Close quote. An attitude of this kind has always been highly questionable, but in our fifth post-Atlantean age, it is particularly fatal because it is being especially urged upon human beings now through the dominance of evil. The evolutionary conditions that hold sway at present mean that when human beings pass through the gate of death, they take with them the conditions of consciousness which they themselves have created for their own lives between birth and death. Let me just read that sentence again. The evolutionary conditions that hold sway at present mean that when human beings pass through the gate of death, they take with them the conditions of consciousness which they themselves have created for their own lives between birth and death. Those who under present conditions concern themselves solely with ideas, concepts, and feelings relating to the physical sense-perceptible world are condemning themselves to living after death in surroundings to which only the concepts developed during bodily life refer. Whereas those who absorb spiritual ideas enter into the spiritual world in the right way. Those who refuse to absorb spiritual ideas have to remain in a certain way within earthly conditions until, and this takes a long time, they have learned over there to absorb spiritual concepts to a degree in which these can carry them over into the spiritual world. So, our environment over there is determined by whether or not we absorb spiritual concepts here. It has to be said with much pity that many of those who have resisted or been prevented from absorbing spiritual concepts here during life find themselves wandering about on the earth even when they are dead, for they remain bound up with the earthly sphere. And once the human soul is no longer separated from its surroundings by a body that would prevent it from acting in a destructive way, this human soul becomes a focus of destruction within the earthly sphere. It has to be said that this is quite a normal situation. Under today's conditions, souls who enter the spiritual world after death, having wanted to know absolutely nothing about spiritual concepts and feelings, become focuses of destruction because they are detained in the earthly sphere. Only those souls who have already here been filled with a degree of connection with the spiritual world pass through the gate of death in such a way that they are taken up into the spiritual world in the right way and removed from the earthly sphere. They can spin the threads in the right way that link them with those who have remained behind, threads which are continually spun. We must not forget that the spiritual threads linking the dead souls with those of us here who have been connected with them are not sundered by death. They remain and even become much more intimate after death than they were here. What I have been describing must be accepted as a serious and important truth. Once again, the fact that this is how things are at the present time is something known not only to me, but to others as well. There are some who make use of the truth in a really nasty way. Today there are those who have been duped into believing that nothing exists except the material life. But there are also initiates who are materialists and who make sure that brotherhoods spread materialistic teachings. Do not believe that these initiates take the ridiculous view that there is no spirit, or that human beings do not have souls that can be independent of the body and live without it. You may be sure that anyone properly initiated into the spiritual world would not subscribe to the absurd notion of believing only in matter. But there are many who are in one way or another interested in spreading materialism, and who make all kinds of arrangements to ensure that a great part of humanity believes only in materialism and is entirely under the influence of materialism. There are brotherhoods headed by initiates who are interested in cultivating and spreading materialism. These materialists are very well served by all the talk about materialism having already been overcome. Aims can be pursued by opposing words. Indeed, the way of going about things is often quite complicated. So what do those initiates want who know very well that the human soul is a purely spiritual being, which is entirely independent of the body, and who, nevertheless, want to cultivate people's materialistic outlook? These initiates want to ensure that as many souls as possible only take in materialistic thoughts here, between birth and death. By this means, such souls are prepared in a way that forces them to remain within the earth's sphere. They are held within the sphere of the earth. Then consider that brotherhoods are set up who know all about this. These brotherhoods prepare certain human souls in a way that makes them remain in the material realm after death. If these brotherhoods then also bring it about that these souls come within their sphere of influence after death, which may well lie within their villainous power, then that brotherhood gains a huge amount of power. These materialists are not materialists because they do not believe in the Spirit. These materialist initiates are not so stupid. They know very well what are the implications of the Spirit. But they cause the souls to remain within matter, even after death, in order to make use of them for their own purposes. They create a clientele of dead souls that remain within the sphere of the earth. These dead souls possess forces that can be guided in various ways, which make it possible to gain quite specific powers over those who are not party to such things. This is quite simply something that certain brotherhoods set in train. And this is seen clearly only by those who are not prepared to believe in anything that is obscure or nebulous, and who do not allow themselves to be persuaded either that such brotherhoods do not exist, or that what they do is harmless. These things are not at all harmless. They are very harmful, for the intention is to make human beings go further and further into materialism. What these initiates want is for these human beings to believe that although spiritual forces do exist, they are nothing but forces of nature. Let me now characterize the ideal held by such brotherhoods. You will have to make some effort to understand the matter. Think of an innocuous human world, which has been led astray a little by the prevailing materialistic concepts of today, and which has deviated somewhat from ancient, well-tried religious ideas. Think of an innocuous humanity of this kind. Perhaps it can be depicted graphically, and he makes a drawing. Here is the realm of that innocuous humanity. As I have said, this humanity is not only not quite clear regarding the spiritual world, it has also been led astray by materialism, and does not quite know how to behave as regards the spiritual world. In particular, this humanity does not quite know what to do about those who have passed through the gate of death. So now let us assume that there is the realm of one of those brotherhoods. This brotherhood is spreading the doctrine of materialism and ensuring that these human beings most probably think in a purely materialistic way. By this means, the brotherhood succeeds in generating souls for itself that remain in the earthly sphere after death. They become the spiritual clientele of this lodge. In other words, by this means, dead souls have been created who do not go out of the earthly sphere, but remain with the earth. By making the right arrangements, they can be held within the lodge. So in this way, lodges have been created which contain the living, but also the dead who have become related to the earthly forces. Matters are then directed by these people here, who hold sessions or by means of arranging meetings, like the spiritual seances of the second half of the 19th century, about which I have frequently spoken. It can then happen, and please take note of this, that what goes on here in the sessions is directed by the lodge with the help of the dead. But it is the intention of the masters in those lodges that the people must not know that they are dealing with the dead, for they are meant to believe that what they are dealing with are simply higher forces of nature. The intention is to show people that these are higher forces of nature, psychism and so on, merely higher forces of nature. The concept of the soul as such is taken away, and the people are told, quote, just as there is electricity and magnetism, so are there similar higher forces, close quote. Those who lead the lodge hide the fact that these things are coming from souls. So those other innocuous souls gradually become dependent, psychologically dependent on the lodge, without knowing what they are dependent on or where that which is directing them is coming from. The only defense against these things is knowing about them. If you know about them, you are protected. If you know about them in that you really regard them as true, that you really believe them to be like this, then you are protected. But you must not be idle about acquiring real knowledge about these things. For the present, however, it can still be said that it is not yet absolutely too late regarding this. These things can only be clarified gradually, and I can only slowly gather together the various elements by which you can be given full clarity. But meanwhile, I have often told you that during the second half of the 19th century, many brotherhoods of the West introduced spiritualism as an experiment. They wanted to test whether they had already reached the stage they intended with regard to humanity. It was an experiment to test how far they had progressed with humanity. What they intended, and indeed expected, was that during spiritualist seances people should say, quote, higher forces of nature do indeed exist, close quote. But the brothers of the left-hand path were then disappointed when most people said, instead, quote, the spirits of the dead appear during the seances, close quote. This was a bitter disappointment for the initiates, for it was exactly what they did not want. Belief in the dead was the very thing which they wanted to take away from human beings. People were to be deprived not of the workings of the dead, not of the way the forces of the dead worked, but of the thought, that very significant thought, that these things do come from the dead. As you can see, this is a higher form of materialism, a materialism that not only denies the existence of the spirit, but wants to imprison the spirit in matter. Materialism still manifests in ways that make it possible to deny its existence. People can say that materialism is gone and that what we are talking about is spirit, but they all speak about the spirit in a vague way, making all nature into spirit in a way that leads to psychism, as the end result is a very good way of being a materialist. But what really matters is the ability to see into the concrete spiritual world, into concrete spirituality. This, then, is the beginning of something that will become more and more intensive over the coming 5 centuries. The evil brotherhoods have now restricted themselves to this, but they will surely continue in their efforts if we do not put a stop to their handiwork. And the only way to put a stop to it is to overcome our idleness with regard to the world view of spiritual science. In some ways, they rather gave the game away in the spiritualist seances. Instead of covering their tracks, they laid bare their tracks through those spiritualist seances which showed that their machinations were not yet particularly successful. So then, from the 1890s onward, those very brotherhoods set about discrediting spiritualism for the time being. In short, you can see that by these means very, very incisive interventions are being made by using the spiritual world. They aim to increase their power and utilize certain conditions of evolution that must obtain during the course of human progress. There is something that is working to counteract the materialization of human souls, the imprisonment of human souls in the sphere of earthliness, where the lodges also have their existence. If the souls are to go about their ghostly work in the lodges, they have to be imprisoned in the earthly sphere. But this endeavor, this impulse to work through these souls in the earthly sphere, is being counteracted by the remarkable impulse of the mystery of Golgotha. This impulse of the mystery of Golgotha provides the universal healing to counteract the materialization of the soul. The pathway of Christ exists entirely outside the will and intentions of human beings. No human being of whatever persuasion, not even an initiate, can influence Christ in doing what leads to his appearance during the course of the 20th century, about which I have often spoken to you, and which you will also find hinted at in the mystery plays. This depends solely on Christ himself. Christ will be present as an etheric being in the sphere of earth. But as to how human beings behave toward him, that will be up to them. No one, not even the mightiest initiate, can have any influence on Christ's appearance as such. Please do remember this. But it is possible to arrange affairs in ways that could lead to this Christ event being received either in one way or in another way, and being effective either in one way or in another way. The brotherhoods I have just mentioned, the ones who want to imprison human souls in the material sphere, are aiming to make Christ's appearance pass by unnoticed in the 20th century. Their aim is to prevent people from noticing his arrival as an etheric individuality. This endeavor is developing under the influence of a specific idea, or rather a specific impulse of will, on behalf of an entirely different being. The brotherhoods want to seize and conquer the sphere of influence that is supposed to come about through Christ in the 20th century and beyond. We shall refer to this in more detail later. There are Western brotherhoods who are striving to deprive Christ of his impulse and put in its place a different individuality, one who has never even been on earth in the flesh, a purely etheric individuality, albeit a strictly Ahrimanic one. All the measures I have been speaking about to do with the dead and so on, ultimately all of these serve the aims of distracting human beings from Christ, who passed through the mystery of Golgotha, and of wrangling affairs in ways that will give another individuality dominance over the earth. This battle is entirely real, and not at all a matter of abstractions. It is a battle that aims to put another being in the place belonging to the Christ being for the remainder of the 5th post-Atlantean age, and also for the 6th and the 7th. One of the tasks of a healthy and honest spiritual development will be to exterminate and remove those endeavors which are eminently anti-Christian. Clear insight alone, however, will be able to achieve this. For the brotherhoods will give the name of Christ, the actual name of Christ, to that other being whom they want to make into the ruler. It will therefore be crucial to learn to distinguish between the two true Christ, who this time will also be an individuality not incarnated in the flesh, and that other being who differs from the true Christ in that he has never been incarnated throughout earthly evolution, but whom those brotherhoods now want to install in the place of Christ who they intend shall pass by unnoticed. So here we have the part of the battle that relates to falsifying the Christ appearance of the 20th century. Those who look only at the surface of life, especially all those superficial discussions about Christ and the Jesus question and so on, they cannot see into the depths. A great deal of fog and hot air is produced in order to distract people from the profounder matters that are really at issue. When theologians have discussions about Christ, there is always from somewhere or other some spiritual influence, so that these people are really helping to promote aims and purposes that are quite different from what they consciously believe. This is what is so dangerous about the concept of the unconscious. Whereas the evil brotherhoods follow their aims very consciously, these things that they follow consciously become what is unconscious in those who get involved in all kinds of superficial discussions. To talk of the unconscious is to bypass the core of the matter. For this so-called unconscious is simply what lies beyond the threshold of ordinary consciousness. And this is the sphere where those who are in the know can develop such things. So you see, this is really one side of the matter which confronts a number of brotherhoods who want to replace the working of Christ by the working of another individuality through arranging everything in favor of achieving this. On the other hand, there are Eastern brotherhoods, especially Indian ones, who also want to interfere in human evolution in a manner no less significant. These Indian brotherhoods are pursuing a different aim. They have never developed esoteric practices by which they can imprison the dead in their realm, in the realm of their lodges. Such things are very far from what they want. But they also do not want the impulse of the mystery of Golgotha to play its part in the evolution of humanity. This is not because they do not have the dead at their disposal, in the way I have described in connection with the Western brotherhoods. They do not want to fight against Christ, who will enter into human evolution as an etheric individuality during the course of the 20th century, by setting up another individuality in his place. To do this, they would need the dead, whom they do not have. What they want to do is deflect interest away from Christ. These Eastern brotherhoods, especially the Indian ones, do not want Christianity to become a force to be reckoned with. They do not want any interest in the real Christ to develop, the real Christ who endured the mystery of Golgotha, and who was on the earth for 3 years in a single incarnation, and who cannot again incarnate on the earth. They do not want to make use of the dead in their lodges. Yet they do also want something different from what they are as living human beings. In these Indian, Eastern lodges, use is made of beings that are different from the dead of the Western lodges. When a human being dies, the etheric body is left behind, which very soon separates off after death, as you know. Under normal circumstances, this etheric body is absorbed by the cosmos. And I have shown you in various ways that this process of absorption is complicated. Before the mystery of Golgotha, however, and also after the mystery of Golgotha, especially in Eastern regions, something quite specific was possible. When a human being relinquishes his ether body after death, certain specific beings can enter into it. With these etheric bodies relinquished by human beings, they become etheric beings. So it can happen in Eastern regions that not dead human beings, but all kinds of demonic spirits are caused to dress up in abandoned human ether bodies. And these demonic spirits, clothed in human ether bodies, are then received by the Eastern lodges. The Western lodges have the dead, who are imprisoned in matter. The Eastern lodges of the left-hand path have demonic spirits. That is, spirits who do not belong to earthly evolution, but who creep into earthly evolution by putting on ether bodies laid aside by human beings. Exoterically, this is done by transforming this fact into worship. You know that certain brotherhoods practice the art of calling forth illusions, because when people are unaware of the degree to which illusion is present in reality, they are very easily duped by artificially produced illusions. So, to achieve what is required, it is disguised as worship. Imagine a clan of people who belong together. First of all, as an evil brother, one has to prepare for the ether body of an ancestor to be occupied by a demonic being. Then one says to the members of the clan that they must worship that ancestor. The ancestor is simply the one who has laid aside his ether body, into which demons have been moved by the machinations of the lodge. In other words, one introduces ancestor worship. But the ancestors who are worshipped are merely demonic beings of some kind in the ether body of the real ancestor. The way in which Eastern people look at the world can be turned aside from the mystery of Golgotha by working in the way those Eastern lodges work. The consequence for the Eastern people is then, and perhaps for everyone, for this is after all the aim, that the goal is achieved whereby Christ, who is to move above the earth as an individuality, remains unnoticed. Those who do this do not want to substitute another being for Christ. They simply want the appearance of Christ Jesus to pass unnoticed. In this way, battle is being waged from two directions against the etheric appearance of the Christ impulse during the course of the 20th century. This is what is really going on around humanity. And whatever happens individually is really always only a consequence of the overall impulses in human evolution. This is why it is so sad when efforts keep being made to persuade people that when the unconscious, the so-called unconscious, works in them, it is the result of repressed love or something similar. Whereas in fact the impulse of very conscious spirituality is being brought in to move about amongst humanity from all sides, which though remains relatively unconscious if one does not make efforts in one's consciousness to be aware of it. You must add various other facts to all this. People who have ever been well disposed toward human evolution have always reckoned with matters such as the ones we have just been describing. For their part, they have done what was right, and in fact one cannot and may not do much more. One very good place where spiritual life was cultivated during the early centuries of Christianity was Ireland, the island of Ireland. This island was thoroughly protected, more protected than anywhere else on earth, against all kinds of illusions. That is also the reason why so many who disseminated Christianity in those early Christian centuries set out from Ireland. Those spreaders of Christianity all had to bear in mind that they were working amongst naive human beings. For the European humanity amongst whom they were working was naive, and allowances had to be made for their naivety. At the same time, they had to know about and understand the great impulses of humanity. Irish initiates, chiefly, were at work during the 4th and 5th centuries in Central Europe. That is where they began, and they worked to prepare for what must happen in the future. The initiation knowledge that influenced them was that in the 15th century, 1413, the 5th post-Atlantean age would arrive. This is what influenced them. So they knew that they were having to prepare an entirely new age. And for this new age, humanity had to be protected so that it would remain naive. What was done in those days to ensure that Europe's humanity would be fenced round in order to prevent certain harmful influences from entering? From a knowledgeable and honest quarter, guidance for evolution came that gradually caused the maritime traffic going from the northern countries to America in those olden times to cease. So whereas in those olden times ships sailed to America, especially from Norway, for certain purposes, it was gradually brought about that America was entirely forgotten by the population of Europe, and the connection with with America disappeared. In the 15th century, the people of Europe knew nothing about America. Because European humanity had to be protected against influences from America, matters were directed, especially from Rome, in ways that caused the links with America to be lost. Some who were very influential in protecting European humanity against influences from America were those very monks who, as Irish initiates, set out from Ireland to bring Christianity to Europe. In those older times, certain quite specific influences were brought back from America. But at the time when the fifth post-Atlantean epoch was beginning, it was important that the European population remained uninfluenced by America, knew nothing about it, and lived in the belief that no such land existed. It was rediscovered once the fifth post-Atlantean age had begun, as historians tell us. One of the truths that you are surely familiar with is that the history we learn in schools is, frequently, a legend. That America was discovered for the first time in 1492 is a legend, for in fact that is when it was rediscovered. For a time it had remained so thoroughly hidden as was necessary. We ought to know what the real situation was, and what the genuine history is, namely, that for a period Europe was fenced round and carefully protected against certain influences that had to be prevented from entering there. Such things show how meaningful it is to regard the so-called unconscious, not as something that is unconscious, but as something that takes place very consciously beyond the threshold of everyday human consciousness. And it is important today that humanity should hear about certain secrets. That is why I have done as much as is possible at the moment to speak quite openly. As you know, in the lectures in Zurich, I even went so far as to explain to people about the degree to which they do not know historical life in their ordinary consciousness, but that in reality they dream it. I said that in reality the content of history is dreamt by people, and that their ideas about it will only become healthy once they realize that the content of history is dreamt. It is through things like this that consciousness can gradually be awakened. The way facts manifest shows the truth in this, only one must not overlook it. People are blind and asleep in the way they make their way through facts. They are also blind and asleep in making their way through tragic catastrophes like those of today. Today I wanted to draw your attention to these matters concerning history, and tomorrow I shall speak in more detail. I want to make one more point in connection with all this. Firstly, from all that has been said, you have seen what a tremendous difference there is in the evolution of humanity between the West and the East. Secondly, please take also the following into consideration. Psychoanalysts speak of the subconscious, of the subconscious life of the soul, and so on. But such an indeterminate concept is not the point. The point is the question, what is there beyond the threshold of consciousness? What exists there? There is certainly a great deal down there beneath the threshold of consciousness, but in itself, what is down there is very conscious. However, one must become aware of what it is, that conscious spirituality beyond the threshold of consciousness. One must speak of conscious spirituality beyond the threshold of consciousness, not of unconscious spirituality. One must realize that human beings have a great deal about which they know nothing in their ordinary consciousness. In fact, it would be most awkward if they had to be aware in their ordinary consciousness of all that goes on inside them. Think of how they would cope with eating and drinking if they had to know exactly what takes place physiologically and biologically when food is eaten, and so on. All this takes place in the unconscious, and in all of it, even these purely physiological processes, spiritual forces are at work. But human beings cannot put off eating and drinking until they have learned about all that goes on inside them. Many other things go on inside them as well. In fact, the greater part, indeed, the greatest part of their being is unconscious, or rather subconscious. The remarkable thing is that in every instance, another being takes possession of this subconscious that we carry with us. We are therefore not only a combination of body, soul, and spirit, in which we carry about within our body the soul, which is independent of us, for shortly before we are born, another being takes possession of the subconscious parts of our being. This subconscious being accompanies us for the whole length of the journey between birth and death. It enters shortly before we are born and then remains with us. To describe this being that fills the parts of us that do not enter into ordinary consciousness, we can say that it is a very intelligent being, one in which the will resembles the forces of nature. It is a being that is very intelligent, and which is endowed with a will that is very like the forces of nature, much more so than is the human will. It has one characteristic which must be emphasized, and that is that it would suffer great danger if under present conditions it were to enter into death together with the human being. Under present conditions, this being cannot share in death, so it absconds shortly before death because it has to save itself. Nevertheless, its endeavor is to arrange human life in such a way that it becomes able to win power over death. For human evolution, it would be terrible if this being that takes possession of the human being were also able to win power over death, if it were able to die with the human being, and in this way enter into those worlds which we enter after death. It always has to take leave of us before we step into the spiritual world after death. But it can find this quite a difficult thing to do, and all kinds of complications can ensue. The fact of the matter is that this being which holds sway entirely in the subconscious is very, very dependent on the earth as a whole organism. The earth is not at all the kind of being presented to us by geologists, mineralogists, or paleontologists, for it is in fact a being full of life. All we see of it is its skeleton, for geologists, mineralogists, and paleontologists present us solely with the mineral part, the bony structure. If that is the only aspect of the earth you know about, then you know more or less as much as you would know about the present distinguished company if you came in here with a special kind of sight that allowed you to see only the bones, the skeletal system. Imagine coming in through the door and seeing rows of skeletons sitting on the seats. Of course, I don't mean to suggest that there is nothing more to you than bones, but if a person could see only bones, it would be as though he were seeing through some kind of X-ray machine. This is all that geologists see of the earth, nothing more than the skeleton. The earth, however, has more than a skeleton, for it is a living organism. And from its center it sends out specific forces to every location, every territory on its surface. Imagine the surface of the earth with an eastern region here and a western one there, to mention only the large-scale situation. The forces sent up out of the earth come from the earth's life organism. When a person lives on the earth at one location or another, it is not, or only indirectly, his soul, his immortal soul, that comes into contact with these forces of the earth. The human being's immortal soul is relatively very independent of earthly conditions. It is only made dependent on these conditions artificially, as I showed you today. But through that other being which takes possession of the human being before birth and has to depart before death, via a detour through that other being, the various forces work especially strongly through racial types and geographical variations. So the geographical and other differences work especially on the double which every human being carries. This is exceedingly significant. Tomorrow we shall see how different effects impinge on this double at different locations on the earth, and what the consequences are. As I told you, it will be necessary for you to make a close connection between what I am telling you today and what I shall say tomorrow, since the one will be barely comprehensible without the other. We must endeavor to understand concepts that take seriously the whole of reality, that reality in which the whole being of the human soul lives. This reality, however, metamorphoses in various ways, and these ways depend greatly on the individual human being. One significant metamorphosis is how, depending on whether they absorb materialistic or spiritual concepts between birth and death, human souls correspondingly tie themselves to the earth, or can enter into the right spheres. Amongst ourselves we must always have clear concepts about these things. Then we shall also gain the right relationship with the world at large. In fact, we must find such a relationship more and more. For us it is not merely a matter of some abstract spiritual movement. Our concern is with a spiritual movement that is entirely concrete, and that reckons with the spiritual life of a whole accumulation of individuals. For me it is very satisfying that talks of this kind are especially significant for those amongst us who no longer belong to the physical plane, but who have passed through the gate of death, although they remain our faithful co-members. It is satisfying that such talks are cultivated as a reality that unites us ever more deeply with those of our friends who have departed. I say this because we should today remember with special love the departure of Fräulein Stinde, who was so intimately bound up with our building here, whose impulses were so intimately linked with the impulses of our building, and the anniversary of whose death fell yesterday. Part 2. With regard to our present considerations, which I have linked to a description of an endeavor to find knowledge by inadequate means, and which have now led us to a wider historical perspective, let me begin both in this connection and in connection with what I said last time I spoke here, with the same purpose and out of the same impulse, by begging you to realize that I am talking about actual events, not some theory, not some system of ideas, but facts. This is the point we must be clear about, because otherwise it will be difficult to understand these things. Rather than propounding historical laws or ideas, I am telling you facts, facts that are connected with the intentions not only of certain individuals who are joined together in brotherhoods, but also of other beings who influence such brotherhoods, and whose influence is also sought by those brotherhoods. Beings who are not incarnated in the flesh like human beings, but ones who have their body in the spiritual world. It is especially necessary to take account of this in the case of a fact such as the one I told you about yesterday. As I explained last year, these brotherhoods belong to different factions. I showed you last year that amongst these brotherhoods there is one faction that is in favor of absolute secrecy about certain higher truths. Then, besides other shades of opinion, there are, especially since the middle of the 19th century, members of brotherhoods who are in favor of revealing certain truths to humanity carefully and with the necessary objectivity, but only those truths which it is immediately necessary to reveal. there are other nuances in addition to these two main factions. So you can see that the intentions, the impulses inserted by those brotherhoods into the evolution of humanity are likely to be a matter of compromise quite frequently. Those brotherhoods who know about the spiritual impulses at work in human evolution saw the approach of that important event of the early 1840s, the battle between certain spirits and some other higher spirits, which ended in 1879, when some spirits of an angel nature, spirits of darkness, fell victim to the event that is symbolized as the victory of Michael over the dragon. On seeing this, those brotherhoods had to decide how to react to it, and had to ask themselves, what is to be done about it? Some members of the brotherhoods, who wanted to do what was right for that time, were to some degree motivated by the best intentions. But they were influenced by the erroneous impression that it was necessary to take account of the materialism of that time. As people anyway wanted to know about things in a physical way, those members of the brotherhoods were intent on teaching them something about the spiritual world by materialistic means, in a physical way. So it was out of good intentions that spiritualism was launched in the world during the 1840s. That battle took place, as I have pointed out, at a time when the attitude on earth was supposed to be a mainly critical one, an understanding directed solely toward the external world. It was necessary then that people had to be given at least an inkling, a sense for the fact that there was a spiritual world all around them. And so, as happens with compromises, this compromise came about. Those members of such brotherhoods who were entirely against certain spiritual truths being made known to humanity found themselves overruled and had to give in and agree to the matter. It was not their original intention to put about in the world things that were connected with spiritualism. But where there are corporate bodies and where there is the will of corporate bodies, compromise ensues. And just as things are in external life, so are they in corporations. When a corporate body makes a decision, those who, for their own reasons, have worked toward this decision expect something from it. But those who were originally against it also have expectations once the decision has been made. Well-meaning spiritual members of the brotherhoods held the erroneous view that by using mediums they could convince people of the existence of a spiritual world all around them. And they thought that on the basis of that conviction it would then be possible to teach them about higher truths as well. This would indeed have been possible if the expectations of those well-meaning members of the brotherhoods had been realized. Namely, if what the mediums revealed had been interpreted as a sign that this was connected with a surrounding spiritual world. But something quite different happened, as I showed you yesterday. People who participated in these things interpreted what came through the mediums as coming from the dead. So what came about through spiritualism actually turned out to be disappointing for everyone. Those who had allowed themselves to be persuaded were naturally exceedingly disconcerted by the fact that one could talk of the spirits of the dead manifesting in the seances, especially as this was true in some cases. And the well-meaning progressive initiates had not expected any mention to be made of the dead, for they had thought people would talk of a general, elementary world. So they too were disappointed. Those who had been initiated in some way are primarily the ones who take note of such things. Apart from the already mentioned members of brotherhoods, there are also those who are members of other or even the same brotherhoods in which minorities or even majorities sometimes form. These other initiates must also be taken into account, and they were those within the Brotherhoods who are termed, quote, brothers of the left-hand path, close quote, namely those who make use, above all, of every kind of impulse involving matters of power that can be brought into human evolution. These brothers of the left-hand path, in their turn, also had all kinds of expectations about what came to light through spiritualism. I pointed out yesterday that brothers of the left-hand path were, in particular, those who made arrangements in connection with the souls of dead human beings. They were especially interested in what might come out of spiritualist seances. Gradually, they took charge of this whole field of activity. The well-meaning initiates gradually lost all interest in spiritualism, and indeed felt ashamed in some ways, because those who, from the beginning, had not wanted spiritualism, told them that they ought to have known from the start that nothing could come of it. This is how spiritualism then came to be taken over by, let us say, the power zone of the brothers of the left-hand path. Yesterday I mentioned those brothers of the left-hand path who were most of all disappointed when they saw that once spiritualism had been launched, it might reveal the very thing set in train by them, which they least of all wanted to have exposed. Those spiritualist seances were where the participants believed they were being influenced by the dead, might provide the very venue where messages from the dead could reveal what certain brothers of the left-hand path did with the souls of those who have died. Perhaps those very souls who had been misused by the brothers of the left-hand path would be the ones to manifest during the spiritualist seances. You must please remember that I am not speaking about theories, but about facts derived from individual people. And if those individuals are gathered together in brotherhoods, one of them might expect one thing from a fact, and another something else from the same fact. When one is speaking about real facts of the spiritual world, it is not possible to seek there anything that is not the result of individual impulses. In ordinary life, too, what one person does can contradict what another does. Theoretically, the law of contradictions cannot be gainsaid. And where facts are concerned, it happens frequently that facts in the spiritual world too are just as likely to be in disharmony as actions of human beings here on the physical plane. You must please always take this into account. In these matters, one cannot speak of realities if one does not speak of individual facts. So, one must distinguish between the separate streams. One must peel them apart. This is connected with something very important, which we must be especially aware of if we want to arrive at a relatively satisfying view of the world. What I am going to say now is a matter of principle, and very important even though it is somewhat abstract. It is a fact to which we must for once pay attention. When working toward forming our view of the world, we strive, quite justifiably, to make sure that the different parts of our worldview harmonize with one another. We do this out of a degree of habit that could not be more justifiable, for it is bound up with all that has been humanity's most beloved treasure of soul and spirit for many centuries: monotheism. We want whatever we experience in the world to be traceable to a unifying foundation. This is entirely justifiable, but not from the angle people usually assume, with justification, but from an entirely different angle about which we shall speak next time. Today, I only want to put before your souls what is principally important. Those whose approach to the world assumes that everything must be explicable without contradiction, owing to having been derived from a unifying foundation of the universe, Those who have this assumption are in for many disappointments, especially if they make their approach to the world and its experiences with an open mind. This is so traditionally ingrained that we treat everything we see in the world in accordance with the pastoral view. Everything is derived from a unifying, divine, original foundation. Everything stems from God, so there must be a uniform explanation for everything. But this is not true. It is not so that all the experiences which surround us in the world stem from a unifying foundation. For in fact, everything stems from spiritual individualities who differ from one another. Various individualities join together to bring about the experiences that surround us in the world. Initially, this is how things are. Next time we shall speak about other aspects, which make monotheism justifiable. But in the first instance, this is how things are. As soon as we step across the threshold of the spiritual world, we must imagine individualities who are rather independent, in fact very independent of one another. And if this is so, then we cannot expect everything that happens to be explicable on the basis of a single unifying principle. Let us draw an experience. Let's say the experience is from 1913 to 1918. Of course, there are experiences before and after as well. Historians will always endeavor to assume that there is a unifying principle manifesting in this developmental path, but there is not. Once we step across the threshold to the spiritual world, it does not matter whether upward or downward, and there's a diagram, we find at work in these events various individualities who are relatively independent of one another. If you do not take this into account, if you assume that a unifying world foundation underlies everything, you will never reach an understanding of the events. You will only understand them properly if you take account of the fact that very varied individualities work either against or with one another in what might be termed the groundswell of events. All this is linked to the profoundest mysteries of human evolution, but the monotheistic feeling has concealed this fact for centuries, even millennia. It must, though, be taken into account. So if we want to make progress in matters of a worldview today, we must, above all, not mistake logic for abstract absence of contradiction. There can be no abstract absence of contradiction in a world where individualities who are independent from one another work together. So whenever the aim is to achieve an abstract lack of contradiction, this will lead to an impoverishment of concepts. Concepts will no longer be able to encompass the fullness of reality. Concepts can only encompass the fullness of reality if they are able to embrace that world of contradictions, which is in fact reality. The sphere of nature we see before us comes into being in a remarkable way. Various individualities work together to create nature, everything we call nature, and summarize on the one hand as natural science, and on the other as nature worship, nature aesthetics, and so on. But in the present cycle of human evolution, a wise guidance has seen to it that a very beneficial arrangement has been made for us. This enables us to conceive of nature by means of concepts relating to a unifying regulation, because through our senses we receive only those experiences of it that depend on such a unifying regulation. Behind the tapestry of nature, however, there lies something else, which receives its direction from quite another quarter. This, though, is excluded from our observation of nature. So, what we call nature is indeed a unified system, because everything else has been screened out. It is as though we perceive nature through the filter of our senses. Everything that is contradictory is filtered out. And the nature we have before us is thus a unified system. Once we cross the threshold, however, and include reality in our explanation of nature, the elemental beings, influences of human souls that can be directed toward nature, then we can no longer talk of nature as being a unified system. For then we also have to include the workings of individualities who either obstruct one another or support and strengthen one another. In the elemental world there are spirits of earth, gnome-like beings, spirits of water, undine-like beings, spirits of air, sylph-like beings, and spirits of fire, salamander-like beings. They are all present there, but they do not carry on a unified regimen. These various realms, the gnomes, undines, sylphs, and salamanders, are independent of one another in some ways. They work not only in rank and file as part of a single system, but they also oppose one another. Their intentions are not linked from the beginning, so what comes about arises from the various ways in which their intentions mutually affect one another. If we know the intentions, we can see in what appears before us, for example, here are fire spirits and undines working together. But we must never believe that there is a single being behind them giving commands, for this is not the case. It is an attitude much held these days. Philosophers like Wundt, of whom Fritz Mautner said, not without reason, that he was an authority by the grace of his publisher, for indeed before the war he was regarded as an authority by almost the entire world, assume that the life of ideas, of feelings, and of will, everything living in the human soul, all belong in a single unit. They say the soul is a unit, so all these must have a single system in common. But this is not true. Those powerful and significant discrepancies found in human life, especially by analytical psychology, would not occur if beyond the threshold our life of ideas did not reach back into regions where it is influenced by individualities different from those influencing our feeling life, and different again from those of our life of will. It's quite extraordinary. Look, here is the human soul. There's a drawing. And within the human soul are the life of ideas, the life of feeling, and the life of will. There are 3 circles. Someone like Wundt, who likes systems, cannot imagine this to be anything but one single system. If the life of ideas leads to one world, W1, the life of feeling to another world, W2, and the life of will to another world again, W3. That is the very function of the human soul, to create a unit for something that is threefold in the pre-human world as matters stand at present. Account has to be taken of all these things when one considers the impulses that are to be incorporated into human evolution. I have said during these lectures that every period of the post-Atlantean age has its own specific task, and I have given a general direction of the task of the 5th post-Atlantean period by saying that it will be up to humanity during this period to come to grips with evil as an impulse in the world. We have talked variously about what this means. It is essential that the forces which manifest as evil, if they appear at the wrong place, must be taken in hand by human endeavor in the 5th post-Atlantean period, in such a way that humanity can achieve something with these forces of evil that will be beneficial for the future of the whole of world evolution. I'm going to read that again. It is essential that the forces which manifest as evil, if they appear at the wrong place, must be taken in hand by human endeavor in the 5th post-Atlantean period, in such a way that humanity can achieve something with these forces of evil that will be beneficial for the future of the whole of world evolution. Because of this, the task of this fifth post-Atlantean period is an especially difficult one. You see, a great many temptations will be visited on humanity as time goes on. When little by little the powers of evil make their appearance, human beings may naturally be much more inclined to give in to this evil in every field, instead of taking up the fight to bring what seems evil to them into the service of world evolution in the sense of what is good. Yet this is what must come about. To a certain degree, evil must be placed at the service of world evolution in the good sense. Failing this, it will be impossible to enter into the sixth post-Atlantean period, which will have an entirely different task. Although human beings will still be linked with the earth, the task will be to enable them to look continuously into the spiritual world and live in spiritual impulses. Connected with the task of the fifth post-Atlantean period concerning evil, there is the possibility that a certain kind of personal darkening for human beings could arise. As we know, since 1879, there have been, within the human kingdom, spirits of darkness, who are the next closest to humanity and belong to the kingdom of the Angeloi. They are here, because they have been turned out of the spiritual world. So now they live in and through human impulses. The fact that there are beings invisibly amongst us who are so closely related to human beings, and that human beings are prevented by the way forces of evil play into their lives from recognizing the Spirit with their reason, which is the task of the fifth post-Atlantean period related to this, means that in this fifth post-Atlantean period there will be many opportunities for people to succumb to obscure errors and such like. During this fifth post-Atlantean period, we must make the effort to comprehend the spiritual through our reason. The Spirit will be revealed, that is certain. Because the spirits of darkness were overcome in 1879, more and more spiritual wisdom will be able to flow down from the spiritual worlds. For those spirits would only have been able to prevent this if they had remained up above in the realms of spirit. They can no longer prevent spiritual wisdom from flowing down. But what they can do is create confusion and bring obscurity to human souls. The opportunities that are being taken to create this obscurity have already been described to some extent. We have already talked about the kind of arrangements that are being made to prevent human beings from receiving the life of the Spirit. All this does not, of course, give cause for lamentation and such like, but provides a strengthening of the power and energy of the human soul in its leaning toward the Spirit. If what can be achieved is achieved by human beings during this fifth post-Atlantean period, through incorporating the forces of evil in the good sense, then at the same time something else, something tremendous, will also be achieved. The fifth post-Atlantean period will then know something grander for the evolution of humanity than has ever been known by any earlier period of Earth evolution. For example, Christ appeared to the fourth post-Atlantean period through the mystery of Golgotha. But only now can the fifth post-Atlantean period absorb him by human reason. Human beings in the fourth post-Atlantean period were able to comprehend that in the Christ impulse they had something that would lead them as souls beyond death. That has been made sufficiently clear by Pauline Christianity. But something even more significant will occur for the development of the fifth post-Atlantean period when human souls recognize that in Christ they have the helper they need to transform the forces of evil into good. There is one thing connected with this feature of the fifth post-Atlantean period. One thing which one should inscribe anew into one's soul every day. One thing which one should not forget, even though human beings are particularly prone to forget this particular thing. This is that in this fifth post-Atlantean period, the human being must be a warrior for the spirit. Human beings must experience how their forces ebb away if they do not continuously hold them in check for the purpose of winning through to the spiritual world. In this fifth post-Atlantean period, human beings stand on their freedom to the highest degree. This is something they have to go through with. The idea of human freedom is the yardstick against which must be measured everything that human beings meet with during this fifth post-Atlantean period. For were their forces to weaken, this could cause everything to turn out for the worst. In this fifth post-Atlantean period, human beings are not in the situation of being led like children. If there are certain brotherhoods whose ideal it is to lead human beings like children, as they were led in the third post-Atlantean period and in the fourth, then these brotherhoods are not doing what is right. They are not doing what actually ought to be done for the evolution of humanity. Anyone who speaks about the spiritual world must do so in a way that leaves people free to accept or reject what he is saying. Someone speaking about the spiritual world in this fifth post-Atlantean period must constantly remind himself of this. Because of this, certain things can only be said in this fifth post-Atlantean period, and the actual saying of these things is now just as important as anything else was in other periods. I will give you an example of what I mean. In our time, the most important thing is to bring forward truths. Put plainly, to give lectures about truths. What people then do about this is up to their freedom. One should go no further than to lecture on, to communicate truths. Whatever consequences there are should follow as a free decision, just as consequences follow when decisions are made out of the impulses one has on the physical plane. It is exactly the same in the case of things that can only be guided from the spiritual world itself. It will be easier to understand this if we go into some detail. Even as late as the fourth post-Atlantean period, other things besides the word, besides mere information, came into consideration. What were these? Let us take a specific example. The island of Ireland, as we call it today, has some quite special features. Certain characteristics make this island of Ireland different from any other place on earth. Every region of the earth differs from the others in certain respects, so as such this is nothing out of the ordinary. Today, though, I want to stress the relatively marked difference that exists between Ireland and other parts of the earth. As you know from my book title, An Outline of Esoteric Science, by looking at the facts that can be gleaned from the spiritual world, we can go back in time and note certain influences and events in the evolution of the earth. You know from an outline how things were in what we call the age of Lemuria. You know what went on in that age and how various aspects developed. Well, yesterday I drew your attention to the necessity of viewing the earth as an organism, and how in different regions it sends out different streams that influence the inhabitants. These streams of influence have a particular effect on the double about which I spoke at the end of yesterday's lecture. In the case of Ireland, the human beings who knew it in olden times described its very special characteristics in the form of fairy tale or legend. An esoteric legend was known to express the being of Ireland within the earth's organism. What people said was this: once upon a time, humanity was driven out of paradise because Lucifer had led humanity astray in paradise. So humanity was scattered across the rest of the world. The rest of the world already existed at the time when humanity was driven out of paradise. So this legendary fairy tale description distinguishes between paradise with Lucifer in it and the rest of the earth into which humanity was driven. But Ireland is different, for it does not belong to the rest of the earth in the same sense, because before Lucifer entered paradise, a likeness of it came into being upon the earth, and this likeness became Ireland. So please understand this. Ireland is that portion of the earth that has no share in Lucifer, that portion to which Lucifer has no connection. The part which had to be separated off from paradise, so that an earthly likeness could arise, would have prevented Lucifer from entering into paradise. So according to this legend, Ireland was seen as the separated off part of paradise, which would have prevented Lucifer from entering into paradise. Only when Ireland had been separated off was it possible for Lucifer to enter paradise. This esoteric legend, which I have represented very imperfectly here, is something most beautiful. For many, it explained Ireland's centuries-long unique task. In the first mystery play I wrote, I touched on how the Christianization of Europe was started by Irish monks. After Patrick had introduced Christianity to Ireland, it took on there the most deeply pious form. The Greeks called Ireland Ierna, and the Romans Ivernia. During the time when the best impulses of European Christianity emanated from Ireland, from Irish monks lovingly initiated into Christianity, the piety of Irish monasteries led to Ireland being called the Isle of Saints, as though in a new interpretation of the legend. This is linked also with the fact that the forces I mentioned, which rise up out of the earth and take hold of the human double, are of the very best kind in the island of Ireland. You might want to say that if this is the case, the very best human beings must live in Ireland. But this is not how things are in the world. Every region has migrants coming in who have descendants and so on. People are not solely the product of the one particular piece of ground they stand on. People's character might quite well contradict what rises up out of the earth. So one must not characterize a specific region of the earth's organism by pointing out what actually develops in the people there. This would be to succumb to the world of illusion. But we can certainly say, as I have just said, that Ireland is indeed a very special location. Such a statement might provide a factor that could lead to fruitful ideas in social politics. Factors like this one I have mentioned in connection with Ireland are factors that should be reckoned with. All these things should be viewed together. There ought to be a science about the shaping of human circumstances on the earth. Before such a science comes into being, there can be no really positive outcome in the way public affairs are managed. What can be said on the basis of what comes from the spiritual world ought to flow into the arrangements that are made. That is why I have been stressing in public lectures how important it is for all those who are involved in public affairs, statesmen and the like, to get to know these things. Not unless they do so will they be able to take control of reality. They have not done it and are not doing it, yet it is what is necessary. Today, in accordance with the tasks of the fifth post-Atlantean period, the important thing is to say these things, to bring them forward. Before what is said can be put into action, decisions have to be taken based on impulses arising on the physical plane. This was not so in former times, when matters were handled differently. At a specific point in time during the third post-Atlantean period, a certain brotherhood caused a good-sized group of people from Asia Minor to go and colonize the island of Ireland. The people who settled in Ireland came from the region of Asia where the philosopher Thales was later born. You can read about the philosophy of Thales in my book titled The Riddles of Philosophy. Thales hailed from the same region, but later, for he was not born until the fourth post-Atlantean period. Those initiates sent the colonists to Ireland from the same milieu, the same spiritual substance from which the philosopher Thales later stemmed. Why? They did this because they were aware of the special characteristics of a region of the earth such as that where Ireland is situated. They knew about what is hinted at in the esoteric legend about which I spoke just now. They knew that the forces rising up out of the earth through the soil of the island of Ireland work on human beings in such a way that they are little influenced toward becoming intellectual, little influenced toward becoming egoistic, and little influenced toward being able to take decisions firmly. The initiates who sent those colonists knew this very well, and they selected people whose karmic inclinations seemed to make them suitable for being exposed to the influences of the island of Ireland. Today, there are still descendants in Ireland of that ancient population, transplanted so long ago from Asia Minor, who were to develop so as to have not even a trace of intellectuality, not a trace of reason, and not the ability to take firm decisions. On the other hand, they were to develop special qualities of heart and soul. Thus preparations were made beforehand for the peaceful spread of Christianity in Ireland, and that glorious development of Christianity in Ireland, which then spread out into the Christianization of Europe. All this was prepared beforehand. Compatriots of Thales, who came later, sent people who then proved to be suited to become monks, able to work in the way I have suggested. Such enterprises were frequent in olden times. So, when you hear historians who do not understand this, though of course they have plenty of understanding of the kind that can be found lying in the street, when you hear these historians describing those people of ancient times, you must always be aware that such colonizations were imbued with profound wisdom. They were guided and steered always with an eye to what was to take place in the future, and account was always taken of the special characteristics of the earth's evolution. That was a different way of bringing spiritual wisdom into the world. Nowadays, those treading the right path are not permitted to act like this. They may not force people against their will to get distributed around the earth. What they have to do today is tell people the truth, and it is then up to them to act. So you see, considerable progress has taken place from the third and fourth to the fifth post-Atlantean period, and it is something of which one must be very well aware. One must realize how this impulse of freedom must run like a thread through everything that governs the fifth post-Atlantean period. It is this freedom of heart and soul which is so strongly objected to by that opponent about whom I have told you that he accompanies the human being from before birth and until death, but who has to depart before death actually takes place. Under the influence of this double, a great deal can emerge which is able to emerge during this fifth post-Atlantean period. A great deal which in the battle with evil is, however, not inclined to give this fifth post-Atlantean period the possibilities it needs to achieve its goal of enabling the evil to be transformed into good to some extent. Consider then what must lie behind all those things in which the human beings of the fifth post-Atlantean period are involved. The correct light must be thrown on the individual facts. They must be understood. Where the double is strongly at work, that is where the true tendency of the fifth post-Atlantean period is being counteracted. But humanity, in this fifth post-Atlantean period, has not yet reached the point of being able to assess these facts properly. Especially in these past 3 sad years, humanity has not been at all inclined to assess the facts at all in any proper way. Let us look at a fact that has seemingly no connection with what I have been speaking about today. Here is the fact. At a large iron foundry, tens of thousands of tons of cast iron were to be loaded onto railway trains, and a certain number of laborers had to be employed for this purpose. It was decided to put 75 men on this job, and it turned out that they were each able to load 12.5 tons per day. So 75 men were to load 12.5 tons each per day. There is an individual, Taylor, who is more concerned with the double than with what would promote the progress of the human heart and soul in the fifth post-Atlantean period. This man asked the manufacturers whether they did not think that a single man could load much more than 12.5 tons per day. The manufacturers thought that one worker could load as at most 18 tons per day. So, Taylor said, let's make an experiment. So Taylor began to experiment with human beings, thus transferring the element of the machine into human social life. He was going to do experiments with human beings. He tested whether what those most practically minded manufacturers said was true, whether one man could really load only 18 tons per day. He introduced rest breaks calculated physiologically to allow for the recoupment of as much energy as had been expended. Of course, it became obvious that this varied from person to person. As you know, such variation cannot be applied to mechanical procedures. You have to take the arithmetical average. But with human beings, you cannot take the arithmetical average, because every individual has a right to his own existence. But Taylor took the arithmetical average. He selected those workers whose break times overall were economical, and these economical break times were allowed. The others who could not recoup their strength in these break times were simply thrown out. In human experiments like these, it turned out that if you selected those workers who recovered fully in the allotted breaks, then every man was able to load 47.5 tons. Thus the mechanism of Darwin's theory is applied to the life of working men. Throw out those who do not fit. Select those who do. Those who fit are the ones who can load not 18 tons, as had previously been thought, but 47.5 tons when given the required rest breaks. This also makes it possible to satisfy the workers' wishes, because when a lot of money is saved, their wages can be increased by 60%. So the ones who are selected, the ones who are best fitted for the struggle for existence, can in addition be turned into very satisfied fellows. But the ones who do not fit might as well starve. This is how a principle is born. Little note is taken of such things, because they are not examined in the light of wider perspectives. But one must examine them in the light of wider perspectives. Today, this is nothing more than an erroneous application of scientific ideas to human life. But the impulse is there. And then it begins to be applied to those things that make their appearance as esoteric truths during the fifth post-Atlantean period. There is nothing esoteric in Darwinism. Nevertheless, if it were to be applied more widely, it would lead to much frightfulness. Namely, if it were to be applied to direct experimentation with human beings. If the esoteric truths that must be revealed during the course of the fifth post-Atlantean period were to be added, though, then one would gain immense power over people, merely through always selecting the most suitable. But it would not remain merely a matter of selecting the most suitable, for by striving to achieve a certain occult invention that would make the most suitable ever more and more suitable, one would achieve immense power that would work counter to the good tendencies of the fifth post-Atlantean period. I wanted to show you how these things hang together in order to demonstrate what the early beginnings of wider intentions for the future look like, and why it is necessary to throw light on them from a higher perspective. Next time, it will be our task to point out the 3 or 4 great truths which must be arrived at by the fifth post-Atlantean period. We shall show how these truths can be misused if they are not applied in the sense of the right and good tendencies of the fifth post-Atlantean period, but instead are made to fulfill the conditions of the double. Conditions represented by those brotherhoods who want to replace Christ by another being. Part 3. In order to expand on them, I shall today refer back to some of the points we have been considering. For long ages, human beings have had thoughts, feelings, and impulses to help them find whatever they needed to make progress. But now the signs of the times are telling us that these thoughts, feelings, and impulses no longer give us what we require to help us go toward the near future. Yesterday, one of our members showed me last Wednesday's issue of the titled Frankfurter Zeitung. In it there is an article by a very learned gentleman. Indeed, he must be exceedingly learned, for his name is preceded by the letters denoting not only Doctor of Philosophy, but also those denoting Doctor of Theology, and these are in turn preceded by the title of Professor. So this man is very clever indeed. His essay is about all kinds of modern spiritual needs, and it contains the following passage, quote, "The experience of the beingness that lies behind everything requires neither pious solemnity nor religious evaluation, for it is in itself religion. It is not one's own individual content that must be sensed and grasped, but the grand irrationality that lies hidden behind all existence. Those who touch it and cause the divine spark to flash across will undergo an experience that is primeval and prototypical. This unites the one who is having the experience with all that moves in the same stream of life. He is vouchsafed a cosmic sense of life, to use a favorite phrase of recent times." Close quote. Forgive me, dear friends. I am not reading this to you in order to awaken any great ideas that might be contained in these wishy-washy sentences, but in order to demonstrate a sign of the times. Quote, "A cosmic religiosity is in the making among us, and the strength of people's longing for it is demonstrated by the perceptible growth of the theosophical movement, which is attempting to discover and reveal the gyrations of that hidden life." Close quote. It isn't easy to stumble through all these wishy-washy concepts, but they are they not, remarkable as signs of the times? The writer continues, quote, "This cosmic piety is not a matter of quietistic mysticism that begins with a rejection of the world and ends in contemplation, for it is received among the rolling waves of events and arouses ever new commotion." Close quote. And so on. It really is not possible to make any sense of all this. But since it is preceded by, quote, "Professor D.D. and D. Phil," close quote, we must surely regard it as something clever, for otherwise we should have to see in it the stammerings and unclear ramblings of a learned gentleman who cannot discern the way forward on the path he is following, but nonetheless feels obliged to hint at something which does exist and which appears to him to be not entirely without hope. We ought not to find anything pleasing in such outpourings, for such outpourings must, above all, not be allowed to lull us to sleep in the pleasant notion that here, once again, is someone who has noticed that there is, after all, something worthwhile behind the spiritual science movement. It would be very damaging if this were to happen, for those who express such outpourings are sometimes the very ones who feel satisfied by them, but who do not press on. In their wishy-washy way, they point to something that wants to enter into the world, yet they remain much, much too idle to embark on any serious study of spiritual science and of what it is that must take hold of human hearts and souls if these realities are to enter the stream of coming existence in ways that will be beneficial. It is, of course, easier to talk of, quote, rolling waves, close quote, and, in quotes, cosmic feelings, than it is to go more seriously into things which, as the signs of the times demand, must be told to humanity just now. That is why it seems necessary to me to say here what I said and will continue to say in the public lectures, while emphasizing the difference between what is dead and gone with no life left in it, but which has led us into the present catastrophic times, and what the human soul must really grasp if any kind of forward step is to be taken. You could hold thousands of congresses, world congresses, and people's congresses, or whatever, involving the old wisdom which has brought humanity thus far, and thousands of societies could be founded. But it must be clearly understood that these thousands of congresses and thousands of societies will achieve nothing if the spiritual lifeblood of the science of the Spirit does not flow through them. What people lack today is the courage to embark properly on researching the spiritual world. Strange though it may sound, it has to be said that a next step could simply be to spread the booklet titled Approaches to Anthroposophy in the widest circles. That would be another way of bringing forward knowledge about the links between human beings and the cosmic order. The booklet draws attention to this knowledge. Attention is drawn to actual facts, such as the way in which the earth changes its states of consciousness year by year. What is said in the lecture and in the booklet is said expressly with the needs of our time in mind. To absorb this would mean more than all that wishy-washy talk of cosmic feelings or mingling with some, in quotes, rolling waves of whatever kind. I've just read these things aloud to you, and I cannot repeat them because they are too meaningless in the way they are formulated. This does not mean that we must not pay attention to these things, for they are important and real. I want to make it clear, though, that we must not create our own fog, but should always retain the utmost clarity if we want to work for the spiritual science of anthroposophy. Once again, I want to remind you that during this fifth post-Atlantean period, the time is approaching when humanity will be having to deal very carefully with certain great life questions that have thus far been hidden, in a way, by the wisdom of former times. I have already pointed this out. One of these great life questions can be described as follows. Endeavors are to be undertaken to place the spiritually etheric element in the service of external practical life. I have already pointed out that the fifth post-Atlantean period will have to solve the problem of how the temper of the human soul, the flow of human moods, can be transmitted to machines in wave-like movements. The human being must be linked with something that has to grow more and more mechanical. A week ago I spoke of the external way in which a certain part of our earth is taking this mechanization. I gave the example of how the American way of thinking is trying to spread mechanical principles to include human life itself. I spoke of the rest breaks that are to be used to enable a specific number of workers to load not fewer tons but up to 50 tons. All that is needed for this is to introduce Darwin's principle of selection into life. At such places, there is the will to harness human energy with mechanical energy. It would be quite wrong to think that we should try to prevent these things, for they will happen. They will come about. The only question is whether they will be brought about as a part of human evolution by people who are selflessly familiar with the great goals of earthly evolution and will do them in ways that are beneficial to humanity, or whether they will be brought about by those groups of people who only want to make use of them egoistically or solely for the sake of their own group. It is not what is done that matters in this instance, for the what will happen anyway. The important thing here is the how these things are tackled. The what will happen anyway, because it is intrinsic in earthly evolution. Welding together human nature with mechanical nature will be a great and significant ongoing problem for the remainder of earthly evolution. Recently, I have often very deliberately pointed out, also in public lectures, that human consciousness is linked with the forces of destruction. Twice in public lectures in Basel, I have said, quote, "We die into our nervous system," close quote. These forces of dying away, will grow ever stronger and stronger. Connections will be created between the human being's forces of dying away, which are related to electrical, to magnetic forces, and external mechanical forces. People will be able in a certain way to steer their intentions and their thoughts into the mechanical forces. As yet undiscovered forces in the human being will be discovered, forces that work on external electrical and magnetic forces. That is the one question, the linking of the human being with mechanisms, this being something that will gain ground more and more in the future. Another problem is the matter of calling on spiritual conditions for help. This will only be possible when the time is ripe, and when a sufficient number of individuals will have been prepared for this in the right way. But it must happen eventually, that the spiritual forces are mobilized to have control over life in relation to sickness and death. Medicine will be made spiritual, very, very spiritual. But caricatures of this will also be created by a certain quarter. These caricatures, however, will only serve to show what must actually come about in reality. Once again, as with the other problem, this matter will be taken up in an external egoistic way by individuals or groups. A third matter is the introduction of human thinking into how the human race comes into being through birth and conception. I have pointed out that congresses about this have already been set up, and also that in future there will be a materialistic elaboration of the science concerned with conception and how man and woman are harnessed together. All these things point to significant developments. Today it is still all too easy to ask why those who know about these things in the right way do not put them into practice. In future, it will be possible to reach an understanding of what is involved in the practical application of these things, and to see what forces are still at work just now, putting obstacles in the way of developing a spiritualized science of medicine, for example, or of economics. One cannot do more today than speak about these things until people have understood them sufficiently, those individuals, namely, who will want to take them up in a selfless way. Many believe they can already do these things. But many life factors still prevent such a thing, and these can only be overcome by allowing an ever deeper understanding to gain ground, and by renouncing, for a while at least, any direct efforts at practical application on a larger scale. In all these matters, it has to be said that not much remains now of whatever existed behind the old atavistic endeavors carried on up to the 14th or 15th centuries. Today people talk a lot about ancient alchemy, remembering the process of producing the homunculus and so on. Most of what is said misses the mark. A time will come when people will understand what is meant by the homunculus scene in Goethe's Faust. But since the 16th century, these things have been shrouded in mist. Awareness of them has receded. The law governing these things is the same law that determines the rhythmical alternation of waking and sleeping in the human being. Just as a human being cannot disregard sleep, so could humanity, where spiritual development is concerned, not avoid the sleep in matters of spiritual science that characterizes the centuries since the 16th century. Humanity had to go to sleep spiritually so that spirituality could reappear in a new form. One simply has to come to terms with such necessities. But we must not be downcast about them. We must realize that the time has now come to wake up, that we can participate in working at this awakening, that events often precede knowledge, and that we will fail to comprehend the events going on all around us if we do not make the effort to gain the knowledge. I have repeatedly mentioned that certain groups of people working in egoistically occult ways are making efforts in certain directions. Initially, it was necessary for a specific kind of knowledge to retire into the background for humanity. Knowledge nowadays given incomprehensible names such as alchemy or astrology and so on. This knowledge had to disappear, be slept through, so that people no longer had the possibility of drawing soul qualities out of their observations of nature, but were instead more thrown back on themselves, so that human beings could awaken the forces of their own being. It was necessary for certain matters to appear first in an abstract form, which must now take on a concrete spiritual form. 3 ideas have gradually been given form over the course of recent centuries. Ideas that are abstract in the way they have come amongst human beings. Kant wrongly called them God, freedom, and immortality. Goethe rightly called them God, virtue, and immortality. What is encompassed by these 3 words is now rather abstract, whereas in the 14th or 15th century it was more concrete, but in the old atavistic sense, also more physical. People experimented in the old way, endeavoring in alchemical experiments to observe processes that revealed the working of God. They tried to produce the philosopher's stone. There is something concrete behind all these things. The philosopher's stone was supposed to help the human being become virtuous, although this was thought of in a more material sense. It was also intended that it should make people able to experience immortality by placing themselves in a relationship with the cosmos that would let them experience what lies beyond birth and death. All the wishy-washy ideas people use today in their effort to grasp these things no longer fit with what was striven for in those days. Things have become abstract, and modern humanity talks about abstract ideas. People try to comprehend God by means of abstract theology, and virtue too as something wholly abstract. The more abstract the idea, the more does modern humanity like talking about these things. The same goes for immortality. People speculate about what could be immortal in the human being. In the first Basel lecture, I spoke of today's science of philosophy being a starved science and undernourished science in the way it deals with questions such as immortality. This is only a different description of the abstract way in which these things are striven for nowadays. Certain brotherhoods of the West, however, have preserved the connection with the old traditions and are trying to apply it in ways that will place it at the service of a kind of group egoism. These things must be pointed out. Of course, when this quarter in the West mentions these things in public exoteric literature, it also talks of God, virtue, or freedom, and immortality in the abstract sense. But those in the circles of initiates know that all this is speculation, and that it is all abstract. Amongst themselves they look for something much more concrete in the abstract formulations of God, virtue, and immortality. So in the schools in question, these words are translated for the initiates. God is translated as gold, and they seek to fathom the question of the mystery of gold. For gold, the representation of what is sun-like within the earth's crust, is indeed something that embodies an important secret. In the material sense, gold relates to other substances as the thought of God relates to other thoughts. The crucial thing is how this mystery is interpreted. This is connected with the way these groups egoistically make use of the mystery of birth. They try to attain a genuinely cosmic understanding. But in recent times, human beings have replaced this cosmic understanding with an understanding that is totally earthly. If they want to study how, for example, the embryo of an animal or human being develops, they point their microscope at what is present at the location on the earth where they are looking through that microscope. They regard this as the thing they should be studying. But this cannot be the case. They will discover, and certain circles are very near to making this discovery, that the forces at work are not to be found in what they are examining through their microscope, but that these forces come in from the cosmos, from the constellation in the cosmos. When an embryo comes into being, it comes into being because cosmic forces, streaming from all the directions of the cosmos, are at work in the living creature, inside which the embryo is forming. What will arise when fertilization takes place will depend on which cosmic forces are active during the fertilization. Something will have to be understood which is not understood as yet. Suppose you have a living creature, a hen, shall we say. When a new life arises within this living creature, the biologist focuses his observation on how the egg is growing out of the hen. He investigates the forces that he supposes are making the egg grow out of the hen herself. This is nonsense. The egg does not grow out of the hen, for she is merely the foundation. Forces ray in from the cosmos and generate the egg on the ground prepared for it within the hen. But the biologist imagines that the forces in question are situated at the spot he is examining through his microscope, whereas what he is seeing is something that depends on the forces of the stars working together in a specific constellation at a certain spot. The truth of the matter will only be discovered when the cosmic forces are discovered, namely, that it is the cosmos that conjures the egg into the hen. All these things are connected above all with the mystery of the sun, and from the earthly point of view with the mystery of gold. What I am putting forward today is no more than a schematic hint, but as time goes on these matters will become much clearer. In the schools that have been mentioned, virtue is not spoken of as virtue, but as health. Here the endeavor is to find out what cosmic constellations are involved when human beings recover their health or fall ill. By getting to know the cosmic constellations, one also finds out about the different substances in the Earth's surface, fluids and so on, that are in their turn linked to health and sickness. From a particular quarter, a more material form of health science will be developed, which will, however, rest on a spiritualistic foundation. The concept to be disseminated from that quarter is that people do not become good through learning all kinds of ethical principles in the abstract, but through taking, let us say, copper under a specific constellation, or arsenic under another constellation. You can imagine how these things can be utilized for the egoistic intentions of certain groups to gain power. Simply by not disseminating such knowledge to others, who are then prevented from participating, one has at one's disposal the best means of controlling great masses of the population. Without making any mention of something like this, one could, for example, introduce a new kind of snack. This new snack, duly adulterated, could then be marketed. Such things can be done when one conceives of these matters in a materialistic way. One must simply be aware that everything material is filled with the workings of spirituality. Only those who know that in the true sense of the word nothing material exists, but only what is spiritual, can plumb the mysteries of life. In a similar vein, there is the matter of bringing the question of immortality into materialistic channels. This matter of immortality can be brought into materialistic channels in similar ways, by utilizing the cosmic constellations. This does not lead to the attainment of what is often speculated to be immortality, but it does bring about another kind of immortality. Since it is not yet possible to work on the physical body as a way of artificially extending life, one prepares to undergo certain experiences in the soul that will enable one to remain within the lodge of brothers even after death, when one can help out with the forces that are then at one's disposal. So in those circles, immortality is referred to simply as life extension. Outward signs of all this are already to be seen. Perhaps some of you noticed the book titled Der Unfug des Sterbens, Death is a Nonsense, that came over from the West and made quite a sensation for a time. Such things are all pointing in that direction, but they are only a beginning, for anything that reaches beyond the beginning is still being stored up for egoistic group activities and kept as something very esoteric. These things are possible if they are brought into materialistic channels, if the abstract ideas of God, virtue, and immortality are turned into the concrete ideas of gold, health, and life extension. If the great questions of the fifth post-Atlantean period I mentioned earlier are used to further the purposes of group egoism. What that professor and doctor of theology and doctor of philosophy wishy-washily termed cosmic feeling is already being presented by many, also unfortunately in many cases in an egoistic sense, as the cosmic knowledge of the human being. Whereas for centuries science has paid attention only to things that work side by side on the earth, and has avoided any glance toward the most important element that comes in from outside the earth, what will happen now in the fifth post-Atlantean period is that specifically those forces which come in from the cosmos will be put to use. And just as the most important thing for biology professors now is to have microscopes that provide the greatest possible degree of enlargement and laboratory procedures that are most appropriate, in future, when science has become spiritual, the important thing will be whether certain processes are put in train in the morning or the evening, or at midday, or whether what one has done in the morning can be further influenced by what works in the evening, or whether it excludes or paralyzes the cosmic influence of the morning until the evening. Of course, much water will still flow down the Rhine before the purely materialistic platforms, laboratories, and such like are handed over to spiritual scientists. But if humanity wants to avoid sinking into complete decadence, the work of these laboratories will have to be replaced by another kind of work. For example, in the case of the good that should be attained in the immediate future, certain processes take place in the morning and are then interrupted during the rest of the day. Then, in the evening, the cosmic streams flow through them again, and the result is then rhythmically preserved until the next morning. In this way, processes take place in which certain cosmic effects are always interrupted during the day and introduced during the morning and the evening. This will call for all kinds of different ways of doing things. From all this, it will be obvious to you that if one is not in a position to take part publicly in these things, then all one can do is to speak about them. Those quarters that want to replace God, virtue, and immortality with gold, health, and life extension are the very quarters which strive to work with forces that are quite different from the forces of morning and evening processes. I mentioned last time that a certain quarter seeks to remove the impulse of the mystery of Golgotha from the world by bringing in another impulse from the West, a kind of Antichrist, and that coming from the East, the Christ impulse, as it appears in the 20th century, is to be paralyzed by distracting people's attention from the coming of Christ in the etheric realm. From the quarter which will put forward the Antichrist as the Christ, will come endeavors to make use of something that can work through the most material of forces, something that can work spiritually through the most material of forces. More than anything else, that quarter will strive to make use of electricity, especially the Earth's magnetism, to bring about effects all over the world. I have shown you how the forces of the Earth rise up in what I have termed the human double. People will discover this secret. It will be an American secret to use the Earth's magnetism in its duality, the northern and southern magnetism, in order to send controlling forces across the whole Earth, forces that work spiritually. Look at the magnetic map of the Earth and compare the magnetic map with what I am about to say, namely the magnetic line where the needle deflects to the east and to the west, and where it does not deflect at all. I cannot now give more than hints about these things. Spiritual beings are incessantly working in from a specific point of the compass. All that needs to be done is to get these spiritual beings to work in the service of earth existence. And then, since those beings working in from the cosmos are able to mediate the secret of the Earth's magnetism, one will be able to fathom that secret. Thereafter, with regard to those three things, gold, health, and life extension, one will be able to work very effectively in the direction of group egoism. It will be a matter of mustering the dubious courage to do these things. And within certain circles this courage will surely be mustered. Coming from the direction of the East, it will be a matter of strengthening what I have already described, by also placing in the service of the Earth those beings who are streaming down from the opposite direction of the cosmos. There will be a great struggle in the future. Human science will turn to cosmic influences, but it will endeavor to do so in various ways. The task of good beneficial science will be to find certain cosmic forces that can come into being on the Earth through the working together of two cosmic streams arriving from different directions. These two cosmic streams from different directions will be Pisces and Virgo. It will above all be a matter of discovering how what works as sun forces from the cosmos coming from Pisces can combine with what works from the direction of Virgo. This is what will be good. To discover how from two directions of the cosmos, morning and evening forces can be placed in the service of humanity, those coming from the direction of Pisces and those coming from the direction of Virgo. These forces will be of no interest to those who endeavor to achieve everything by means of the dualism of polarity, through positive and negative forces. The spiritual secrets that on earth can cause the spirit to stream through from the cosmos, with the help of the dual forces of positive and negative magnetism. These spiritual secrets derive from the direction of Gemini. They are the forces of midday. Even in ancient times it was known that this is something cosmic, and scientists today know exoterically that behind Gemini in the zodiac, positive and negative magnetism exists in some way. Here it will be a matter of paralyzing what should be one from the cosmos through the revelation of duality. A matter of paralyzing this in a materialistic, egoistic way through the forces that stream to humanity, especially from Gemini, forces that can be put to work entirely in the service of the double. Then there are the Brotherhoods, who want to bypass the mystery of Golgotha. They will make use of the human being's dual nature, which now in the 5th post-Atlantean period contains on the one hand the human being, and on the other the lower animal nature. The human being truly is a centaur in a certain way, for he contains the lower animal nature astrally, and in a way the human part is simply grafted on to this animal nature. Here again we have a duality of forces in the way these two aspects work in the human being. This is a duality of forces that certain egoistic brotherhoods in a more easterly, Indian direction will use to lead also the eastern part of Europe astray. That part of Europe which has the task of preparing for the 6th post-Atlantean period. This dualism makes use of the forces coming from Sagittarius. What lies in store for humanity is that the cosmic forces will be one for humanity in a dual way that is wrong, or a single way that is right. This will bring a genuine renewal to astrology, which is atavistic in its old form, a form in which it cannot continue to exist. Those who know about the cosmos will struggle against one another. Some will make use of the morning and evening processes in the way I have suggested. In the West, the midday processes will mostly be used, while the morning and evening processes are excluded. And in the East, the midnight processes will be used. It will no longer be a matter of making substances only according to the chemical processes of attraction and repulsion, for people will know that the substance will be different, depending on whether it is produced by means of morning and evening processes or by midday and midnight processes. They will know that such substances work quite differently on the trinity of God, virtue, and immortality, or gold, health, and life extension. It will not be possible to achieve anything bad by means of a collaboration between what comes from Pisces and Virgo. What will be achieved through these will, it is true, detach the mechanism of life somewhat from the human being, but it will not be a foundation for any kind of power or dominion of one group over another. The cosmic forces brought in from this direction will produce remarkable machines that can be labor-saving for people because they will contain a degree of intelligence. And it will be the task of a science of the spirit concerned with the cosmos to ensure that all the great temptations emanating from these machine animals, created by human beings themselves, will be unable to have any damaging influence on them. Something important must be said in connection with all this. It is essential to prepare for it all by no longer assuming that realities are illusions and by really entering into a spiritual view of the world and gaining a spiritual grasp of the world. Much depends on seeing things for what they are. But we can only see them for what they are if we are able to apply to reality the concepts and ideas given to us by the spiritual science of anthroposophy. For the remainder of earthly existence, the dead will collaborate with us to a high degree. But how they collaborate will be what matters, for there will be great differences. It will be important that people on the earth behave in such a way that collaboration with the dead, in a good way, can be allowed to be guided by them, so that the impulse coming from them is the starting point, coming from the spiritual world which the dead themselves experience after death. There will also, on the other hand, be many attempts to introduce the dead into human life by artificial means. The dead will be brought into human life via a detour through Gemini, which in quite a specific way will cause human vibrations to continue resonating in the machines. The cosmos will then move the machines via the detour I have just mentioned. If these problems arise, it will be important to use nothing improper, but only those elemental forces derived from nature itself. One must not introduce any improper forces into the life of these machines. In this occult field, one must not harness the human being to the mechanism in any way that makes use of the Darwinistic theory of selection in connection with human labor, as in the example I gave last time. I am giving you all these hints, which cannot of course exhaust the subject in such a short time, because I am sure you will continue to mull them over and endeavor to build a bridge between them and your own life experiences, especially those we are gaining today in these difficult times. You will see how much clarity you will gain when you look at things in the light of these ideas. It is not a matter now of a confrontation between forces and constellations of forces, about which so much is being said in external, exoteric life, for it is a matter of quite other things. What is happening now is that a kind of veil is being drawn over the true impulses we are concerned with. Human forces are at work trying to garner something for themselves. What do they want to garner? Certain human forces are at work defending the impulses that were justifiable impulses up to the time of the French Revolution, and were then also represented by certain secret schools. But now the endeavor is to represent them in a retarded, Ahrimanic, Luciferic form, in a way that would maintain a social order thought to have been overcome by humanity since the end of the 18th century. In the main, there are two camps in opposition to one another: the representatives of the principle that had been overcome by the end of the 18th century, and the representatives of the present time. Of course, a great number of people instinctively represent the impulses of the present time. So those who are supposed to represent the old impulses of the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries will have to be harnessed by artificial means, emanating from certain brotherhoods working to promote their group egoism. The most effective principle of modern times that can be used to extend one's power over the number of people one wishes to use is the economic principle, the principle of economic dependence. But this is merely the tool. The real concern is something quite different. The real concern is what you will have surmised from all the hints I have been giving. The economic principle is connected with all that can be used to make a huge number of people across the earth into a kind of army for these principles. These are the matters that confront one today, the ones that are really doing battle in the world today. Rooted in the West, there is the principle of the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries, which makes itself invisible by clothing itself in the phrases of the Revolution. the phrases of democracy, the principle which dons this mask and is striving to gain as much power as possible. It is advantageous for this principle if as many individuals as possible make no effort to see things as they really are, and constantly allow themselves to be lulled by Maya, the Maya that is expressed in the words, "There is a war going on between the Entente and the Central Powers." In reality, there is no such war, and our concern should be for quite other things that are the true reality behind the Maya. The battle of the Entente with the Central Powers is merely an illusion. We can reach a conclusion about what is really doing battle if we look behind things and illumine them in the way I am, for certain reasons, only hinting at. One must at least try for oneself not to mistake illusion for reality, and then the illusion will gradually dissolve as far as is necessary. One must try above all to see things as they show themselves to a realistic and unprejudiced view. If you look at all the things I have been unfolding here, you will find that even a remark I made on the side during these lectures was not as unimportant as it might have seemed. When I said that a remark made by Mephistopheles to Faust, quote, "I see that thou the devil knowest," close quote, would not have been made by him to Woodrow Wilson, this was not an unimportant observation. It was in fact intended to throw light on the situation. One must be able to look at these things without either sympathy or antipathy. They must be seen objectively. One must consider what constellations signify in something that is at work, and what a person's own forces signify. Frequently something entirely different lies behind a person's own forces than what lies behind the mere constellation. Ask yourselves objectively what the value of Woodrow Wilson's brain would be if this brain did not happen to be seated upon the presidential chair of the North American Union. Assume that this brain were situated in a different constellation. That is where it would reveal its own personal force. So it is the constellation that matters. Let me put it in the abstract and radically, although not to illustrate the instance I have just mentioned, for I would not do such a thing in this very neutral country. Apart from that instance, consider the important insight that would be revealed if one were to ask whether a certain brain attained its value through being illuminated spiritually in a special way, in the sense I have been describing in these lectures, or whether its value scarcely exceeded the result obtained by placing it in a scale and balancing it against weights in the other scale. The moment you penetrate fully into all the secrets of the double, whom I mentioned last time, you will find yourself able to assess the value of brains that are merely lumps which you have placed on a scale, lumps which can be brought to life solely by the double. All these things appear grotesque to people today, but everything that is grotesque about them must come to be seen as perfectly ordinary if certain matters are to be guided from harmful into beneficial channels. There is no point in constantly talking round them. You must come to realize that all the wishy-washy talk of, in quotes, cosmic religiosity, or in quotes, how powerful the yearning for it is, or in quotes, the movement that is undertaking to discover and unveil the circulations of life not accessible to the senses, and so on, is also nothing other than a means of spreading fog over these matters, which ought actually to be entering the world in clarity, which can only work in clarity, and which above all ought only to be carried in clarity into human life as practical, moral, and ethical impulses. I can only bring you certain isolated hints. So now I leave it to your own meditation to build further in these matters. Much is aphoristic. But if you take summaries such as the zodiac I have drawn here, and really use it as material for meditation, you will be able to derive a very great deal from them.